Welcome, everyone. I'm Charles Cullen, the interim president and CEO of the Historical Society for another week. And I welcome you to this November program that we are offering. We're very pleased tonight to be featuring an author and a friend. Let me tell you a few things about our author tonight. Alice George is a historian with a distinguished journalistic background. She holds a PhD in history from Temple, an MA from the University of Pennsylvania, and a BA from Dickinson College. Her fields of expertise include Cold War culture and public history, Philadelphia history, and 20th century American political history. Her award-winning doctoral dissertation was published in 2003 as Awaiting Armageddon, How Americans Faced the Cuban Missile Crisis. After producing 6 additional books, including 2 on Philadelphia history, she wrote The Assassination of John F. Kennedy, Political Trauma and American Memory in 2012, and The Cuban Missile Crisis, The Threshold of Nuclear War in 2013. She has contributed to various academic publications and conferences and currently chairs the board of Intercultural Journeys and serves as vice president of the National Theodore Roosevelt Association. I know her best as a vice chair of the board of the Historical Society, overseeing the Committee on Collections and Programs. Welcome, Alice. We've been looking forward to this for quite a while. We had to wait until your book was published yesterday. Congratulations on the publication.
Thank you.
I'd like to start by asking you to tell us what led you to Glenn. Why did you choose Glenn as a subject for Alice, excuse me, I forgot one thing, an important thing, and that is that we welcome questions throughout the interview. We're not going to wait until the very end to invite you to ask questions. If you look at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A icon that you can click on and submit your questions at any time during the program. I may use some of those questions during the program, or we may do them at the end, depending on how they come in. But I wanted to call your attention to that. So now, Alice, what led you? Why did you decide to do a biography of John Glenn?
I was looking for a subject for a project, and when John Glenn died, I was struck by the fact that so many headlines all called him a hero, and I thought, when's the last time I heard a single American called a hero? And it's really not something that happens in the 21st century. You know, people sort of roll their eyes at the same time that the word comes out of their mouths. And so I thought, this is really interesting. So I looked for a good biography of him, and there wasn't one. And so then I read his autobiography, and I thought, wow, he had an amazing life.
He wrote an autobiography.
Yeah, he wrote a memoir in the late 90s. Huh. And I really benefited because as part of his thinking process for that, he did 23 oral history interviews, and I was able to go through those interviews. And in a lot of cases, I didn't think he put the best stuff in his memoir. So I was able to take the best stuff and use it. But I just felt like that was a hole in the scholarship, that there was nothing about him. And the fact that he was still considered a hero, I thought, was an interesting angle on the whole thing.
Well, you use the word hero in the title, and I want to talk some more about that. But first, I liked your prologue so much. I thought your prologue was just super, as was your epilogue, and they were almost apart from the rest of the book in that they seemed to summarize everything you really thought about Glenn and why he was important. And I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about the things that you wrote about, the conclusions you drew about him and why he was a hero, and we'll come back to the epilogue at the end. appropriately. But what was it about Glenn that and in the process, I think it would be helpful to those who haven't read the book yet, and those who know, as I did when I read your book, the only thing they know about Glenn is that he was a space explorer, or at least he was the first man in orbit, and that he went again in, was it 97, 98?
98.
And that he was a U.S. Senator. I think everybody knows that, but they don't know much more about him. So talk a little bit about the things you wrote about in your prologue about what made him a hero.
He was a young man in college when the attack on Pearl Harbor happened. He immediately dropped out, immediately signed up with first the Army, which didn't get back in touch with him fast enough. So then he went and signed up with the Navy instead, because he really wanted to go and play his part. He also served in the Korean War. He flew 149 successful missions in both wars. And he felt that that was really what he was born to do, because he was so good at it. He, at the end of his Korean War service, he had a period where he worked with the Air Force and flew against MiGs and actually sort of did jet dogfights over North Korea. And he downed 3 MiGs in the last few days of the war. And he was just an amazing person. And after that, he worked in various jobs in the Marine Corps, and then he set the record for flying a plane the fastest from Los Angeles to New York.
That was an exciting part of the book, yeah.
Yeah, and he won the game show, Name That Tune. I mean, there's so many interesting things. And also, if you look back at his in his war service, in World War II, he met Charles Lindbergh and flew with Charles Lindbergh. And in the Korean War, his wingman was Ted Williams. He just had an amazing life. Anybody who came home and said Ted Williams was my wingman, you'd be astounded. And so he did this, he did his war service. He met incredible people along the way. He appeared on TV and won this game show, and then he became an astronaut. And when he became an astronaut, they were the 7 men were chosen from test pilots, military test pilots. And you might expect the test pilots would be kind of short-spoken guys who got right down to business and got the job done. And that's what 6 of them were, but that's not what John Glenn was. John Glenn was a man who cherished his family, he cherished his church. He had an incredible marriage to the only woman he dated in his whole life, a woman he met in his playpen when he was a toddler. And so when the astronauts were named, all of them were just kind of like saying yes, no, oh shucks, that kind of answer. And he was very much opening his life up for everybody to see how much he loved his family, how much his family's opinion mattered in what he did with his career, how important his religion was. So the public saw so much more of him just because he knew how to talk to reporters. He knew how to talk about himself and what was important to him. He didn't just focus on the technical side.
But it was a natural thing for him. I mean, it came out of his natural personality, as opposed to something that was studied. And so you write about how he emerged as the spokesperson for the astronauts, the 7 Mercury astronauts, and how that seemed to happen sort of accidentally, but because of what you were just saying, that the reporters might ask a question and he was the only one who would talk with ease, and so they turned to him, and he became the spokesperson for them and remained the spokesperson for the space program, didn't he? Was there any, you're right about this, but talk a little bit about whether there was any, I mean, these guys who are test pilots and the first men in space, you know, they all must have ego, and John Glenn didn't seem to be motivated too much by ego, but emerging as the spokesperson, was there any resentment or any competition among them in those settings? And you know, they all wrote in, let me just jump ahead and say that when they came back from their first flights, there were ticker tape parades all over the country.
Right.
And they were all in the convertibles riding down Broadway and other streets, and yet John Glenn was the one everybody remembers.
Well, John Glenn certainly was somewhat resented by the other astronauts, but they called him the Boy Scout and his own friends admitted that while he was an astronaut, whatever he was doing, he was thinking, what if a child somewhere on the other side of the country saw me doing this? Would they be proud of me? Would I be setting a good example? And he really thought about that all the time, because he realized there was some responsibility with the fame that he had received. And so he tried to be exemplary, and in many ways he was exemplary, and the other astronauts wanted none of that. They were pilots, so they were tough guys, and they wanted to, you know, break records and things like that, but they were not thinking about whether children would approve of the way they were acting or whether they were setting a good example.
So he did it with ease, though, as opposed to ego. So, for example, when he broke the record flying from California to New York, he didn't emerge from the plane on the East Coast and, you know, and strut across the way and say, you know, he did it more, but it was a natural thing, as you write about him. He might have been conscious of what was being seen in his feats, but he wasn't saying, look at me, look at me. I did this. It was sort of like, you could do this too, wasn't it? I mean,
yes, and he was in every case, including when he set that record, and as an astronaut, he was always surprised by how much attention he got.
Yeah.
And you know, when he orbited the Earth, that attracted tremendous attention in the United States, because for the first time, there was a huge news event that lasted 4.5 hours, which is a manageable amount of time. Americans had portable TVs, they had transistor radios, both of which they didn't have 10 years before. So they could take their radio to school or their television to work and follow his flight. And the fact that the United States was openly covering his flight, that whole day, Walter Cronkite was on the air for more than 9 hours. And every minute of it, you knew what was going on, which was such a contrast to the Soviet Union, where we didn't find out that a flight had even happened until after it had ended successfully. So Americans were really drawn to the drama of what's going to happen to this man during these 4.5 hours. Our scientists had no idea what the effects of weightlessness would be. And, you know, because the Soviet Union didn't tell us what their cosmonauts had learned, John Glenn was really had a long list of unknown things to figure out during those 4.5 hours. And it was just a moment when the nation stopped and everybody was watching. In Grand Central Station, they had a TV that was 25 feet by 25 feet, and they had a crowd at times that was as many as 7,000 people standing there watching him. And all day long, you could go to Grand Central Station, there'd be this huge crowd just shoulder to shoulder, squeezed in, trying to see what was going on with John Glenn. And it made him very different from the other astronauts, because the first two astronauts, Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom, just went up and came straight back down. They had 15-minute flights. Nobody had any time to follow them because they were back before you knew it.
Over, yeah.
But Glenn really caught everybody's attention, and
The first time, did he go around more than once?
he went around 3 times.
3 times, yeah. So it did last a while. And you
Yeah.
make a good point that the Russians had beat us to all of these things except to the moon. But at the time he did his flight, the Russians had already done that, but they went around only once, I think. But nevertheless, it was done in secrecy, whereas this was done in full view of the world, those who were connected to television, and it sort of gave the U.S. a leg up in terms of the achievement. That it surpassed the Soviet Union.
It really, yeah, it really did. And when you know, for instance, you know, in Australia, the city of Perth left its lights on all night, and people put sheets out on their lawns and did everything possible, left every neon light on to try to attract Glenn's attention when he reached the dark side of the Earth. So it was really a worldwide sensation, and he got fascinating letters. There was a letter from a Japanese officer, military officer, who said he cried when he listened to the coverage of the flight. And you know, Voice of America was broadcasting it around the world, and even the Soviets, who normally blocked Voice of America from getting into Eastern Europe, didn't, that particular day, they did not choose to do that. They did not jam the signals. So he got fan mail from people in communist countries. He got fan mail from people all over the world. There was one that was from a young child, I think it was a teenager from Vietnam. He was just such a figure to the whole world that day because everybody could follow it. It was the first time there'd ever been a space flight where everybody could sort of feel like they knew what was going on.
We have a question from someone asking, why was he chosen for that orbital flight out of the 7? Was there any special reason, or was it just the luck of the draw?
On January 19th of 1961, the day before JFK was inaugurated, the NASA officials told the 7 astronauts that the first 3 astronauts would be Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, and John Glenn. And the thing that the astronauts all aspired to was being the first person in space, the first man in space, or the first American in space.
Including John Glenn?
Including John Glenn.
He wanted that also.
He really wanted to be the first one too.
Well, he's not,
but
he was entirely a Boy Scout then.
Yeah, he was told then that they had chosen Shepard to go first and then Grissom, and that Glenn was going to be the backup for both of them. And Glenn was not happy about it. He did complain about it some, but it ultimately worked in his favor because everybody assumed that the first astronaut would be the most famous one. So when Alan Shepard was chosen and went up, everybody thought, well, he's the guy. And his trip was so fast, and it did not really bring people into the space program in the way that Glenn's did. So what happened was that Glenn just happened to be as the 3rd one. He was really the first, he was the first to orbit the Earth, which turned out to be more important than being the first astronaut to go up.
I see, yeah. So it was mainly, I mean, they had chosen 3, and he happened to be number 3, and number 3 was the orbital flight, as opposed to the up and down.
Yeah.
I got so many things I'd like to ask you about, but I think before we become totally absorbed in what made him the most famous and what made him a hero, tell us a little bit about the other parts of his career. I mean, you write about how, I mean, it was a small part, and he is justly remembered as for the things we're talking about. We haven't talked about his Senate career, which was 24 years, I think. It's not insignificant. But what else? You know, he was in business for a while, and he after the space program, he went to he was in education, and you know. But tell us a little bit about the other things he did for extended periods of time that help fill out his career.
Okay, he left NASA in 1964 because he was frustrated that he couldn't get another flight. And he was really curious about why they kept telling him he couldn't go up again. And he didn't know that JFK had asked NASA not to risk his life in a flight because JFK thought he had such an inspirational role that he should be kept safe. And so Glenn left NASA and he decided to run for the Senate from Ohio after JFK was assassinated. He felt a call to service, and he started to run for the Senate in '64, and then he took a bad fall in the bathroom, and there were a lot of jokes about this guy can fly in space, but he falls down in the bathroom, and then he ends up having to drop out of his Senate race because his equilibrium was ruined, and he had to spend about a year getting that treated to get back to normal. And so after that, he went to work for Royal Crown Cola, which was at the time trying to get franchises in countries all over the world. And they hired him first as a board director and then as head of their international division. And he did that for a few years. And at the same time, NASA kept asking him to make goodwill trips around the world. So he kept doing that at the same time that he was working for Royal Crown. In 1968, he got really, really involved in politics as Robert Kennedy's friend and helper during Robert Kennedy's presidential campaign. And then after that, he continued to work for Royal Crown for a while he started to begin the real quest to get the Senate seat, which he failed in 1970, and then he finally got the seat in 1974. And so that was sort of his big transition period. He even during that period, he tried out to a TV documentary show where he would be the host. He was very open to a lot of different ideas. And so then he served in the Senate longer than any other senator from Ohio ever had. And then after his Senate term was over, Ohio State started a John Glenn school that essentially teaches young people both in both how to work within government in public service and how to work through philanthropy in public service and nonprofits. So when he finished his career in the Senate and made his last space flight as the oldest person ever in space in 1998, then he went to the school and taught classes and helped to develop that. And many people think that in a way that may be his biggest legacy because so many students will pass through that program. And even when he was in his 80s, he was still serving on government commissions and doing whatever anybody asked him to do.
Well, you write about how he, there are two things I'd like to address in your analysis of him as a person and as a hero. But one was that you talked about how he really loved flight, and as I was reading the book, that became very clear to me. And he wanted to get back into space. He wanted to fly, and you know, as an ace pilot during the two wars he fought in, And then when he went into the program, he wanted to fly. And I think his happening to be the third one to orbit gave him a chance to really fly the module, which, you know, took a little bit of skill. And it seems to me it would have appealed to his love of flying and his desire to get back in. I understand completely. I don't think in the book that you at least I must have missed it, because I wondered why JFK didn't want him to continue or to go back into space. And I think that maybe in the epilogue, which I reread recently, it came out that it was his safety and the chance of losing him as this representative of the whole space program and the feats that the space pilots had achieved. But I think that, you know, because they wouldn't let him back in for fear of his life, tells us two things. One, that it's really dangerous. And two, that he really wanted to fly. And that led me to think about whether, you know, when he went back in '98, with the Discovery, wasn't that the name of the program?
Yes.
6 others
Yes.
for they were up there quite a while. How long? Days.
9 days.
9 days. And you write more then about how he kind of shifted to thinking that the most important part of the program and the reason it must continue was the experiments and the discovery, as opposed to the flying. So did he actually make that transition, or did he think when he went back up in '98 that, I mean, he was already pretty old. He must not have thought he was going to get to fly this thing. But was there a transition? Did he, there must have been, because of all his, tell us about that, but the things he thought the value of the space program represented and why he was so upset when Obama canceled the official, you know, said there'd be no more US or NASA shots. And we now know that we've switched over to commercial, but he didn't know that was going to happen, I guess. But talk a little bit about that transition in his thinking, because I think it speaks a lot to the value of the space program and his role in it as a spokesperson.
I think you were absolutely right that he loved flight and that was the driving force behind him when he got into the space program, was just the challenge of being able to fly and to do new things that nobody had ever done before. And he continued to fly as a private pilot until his late 80s, when either he or his wife got such bad knees that they couldn't get fit into a private plane easily. But he never lost the love for flight, but he did. He understood the moon, the reason that JFK wanted to go to the moon, and the role that played in the Cold War by us being able to achieve something the Soviet Union couldn't achieve. And he realized when he was a Mercury astronaut that he was the cog in that wheel that was going to go to the moon. But once we had gone to the moon, as he considered what the goals of the space program were more and more, he thought we should be more focused on the Earth and on understanding our own planet rather than trying to get somewhere else. And so that's why he so valued his experience on the Discovery and the many different, you know, experiments that were going on there, and that he could participate in some of them. And at that time, you know, he really said, well, George W. Bush came out at some point during his administration and suggested that we go back to the moon and that we go to Mars. And Glenn felt like that was sort of the wrong direction, because he said, you know, we helped to build the International Space Station. We should focus on that. We should focus on the Earth. And he felt very strongly about the fact that we needed to get our money's worth and that the Earth needed the attention that it could get from a strong space program. So that's where he decided we should put our emphasis instead of trying to do other flying spectacular things.
Well, another part of his life and your book that I'd like to ask you to address is the well, the title, but the whole hero aspect. You know, it's the subtitle or the title. The title is The Last American Hero. And I'm reminded that Tom Wolfe wrote a piece in 1965 and said, the last American hero is Junior Johnson. And Cameron Crowe wrote a piece in I think it was in the 70s, on Neil Young, calling him the last American hero. And Mike David in The Nation this year wrote a piece called Anthony Fauci, the last American hero. So I'm not challenging your choice of the title, but this whole question about American heroes and, you know, what does it take to be one? And you know, tell us what made, in your view, what made Glenn a hero. I mean, was it daring? Was it science and technology? Do you have to be in exploration or civic activism? Electoral success? I mean, we've got American heroes, you know, George Washington, Patrick Henry, Paul Revere, Lewis and Clark, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, on and on and on, Bobby Kennedy, JFK. So what is it that leads us to identify a person as a hero? And do you think our concept of a hero has changed over time? And my last part of this is, what role do you think media plays in creating an American hero? I mean, obviously a person has to have some characteristic that deserves the attention. We hope. I mean, unless it's, well, I mean, Neil Young is a good musician. You've got to have some talent to be a hero and contribute in some fashion. And Glenn certainly contributed in many fashions and is without question a hero. But since it's part of your title, and you know, even in your epilogue, I think you write more about him as a hero and why you think he is a hero. So talk about that a little bit, if you will.
Well, that was a very long and expansive question, Charles, but I'll try to hit all the points if I can. At the beginning, you listed off several people who had identified someone as the last American hero, and I think the really striking thing about that is that we all think it's the last one. The sense is that America is no longer a country that's going to worship heroes. We follow celebrities. We celebrate groups of people, such as after September 11th, we honored the first responders. Right now in the COVID issue, we praise doctors and nurses and other medical workers, but we seldom pick out an individual. And I did actually ask several people, you know, can you name a hero who's alive right now? And one person ventured, Sully Sullenberger, who safely landed the U.S. Airways plane in the Hudson River without losing any of his passengers in 2009. And he was not a military man, but he did something spectacular, and it was heroic because nobody thought it could be done, and he didn't seek to profit from it, which is another thing that makes people more heroic, is if they don't try to profit too much off of what they've done.
Same with Glenn. I don't think we can say that Glenn was elected to the Senate because of his space exploration. I mean,
No, he definitely wasn't. He had hard political fights to get into the Senate, and he had to have strong opinions. I think, you know, what it takes to be a hero, one of the things that Glenn definitely had that most of us don't have is that he continually stepped up and volunteered to serve his country. He did it in the military, he did it as an astronaut, he did it in the Senate over and over again. If there was an opportunity for Glenn to do something for his country, he did it. He wasn't a general. You know, we've had a lot of presidents who were generals, but he wasn't that. He was a fairly modest man, although he was surprisingly comfortable when people treated him as a hero. He was happy to sign autographs, not because it made his ego feel good, but because it meant something to other people to have his name on a piece of paper. And so he was willing to share his name with them. I think, I really hope he's not the last American hero, because I would like to see us go back to a time when we do honor individuals for doing the right thing, and when compromising is not a sin. That was one of his strengths in the Senate, was he was always willing to reach across the aisle to the Republicans. But now we see very little, if any, of that. And I think there are just certain qualities in a person that set them apart from others. And, you know, one of them is the willingness to work hard to get difficult things done. And that was something that he did throughout his life over and over again. And didn't matter that his life was often at risk. You know, even in 1998, when he flew at 77, you know, his life was at risk then too, but he was happy to do it. And he did it, and he said, you know the risks, but you understand that it's worth it. And you know, we had 7 original Mercury astronauts. One of them died in the space program. He didn't die in space, but Gus Grissom died in a fire during a test on Apollo 1. And John Glenn always knew that probably one of them was going to die, and, you know, that it was a chance that they were all taking. And he was willing to take chances over and over again to try to make sure the right things happened. And challenges appealed to him. It was not totally unselfish, because he liked challenges, but it wasn't to make himself famous that he wanted to face the challenges. It was because it made him feel good to know that he had stood up to the challenges and had triumphed.
Well, you know, I think, you know, test pilots, he wasn't a test pilot, but he had, you know, he was in that group with test pilots, and you know, there's a certain personality. And I think it's interesting that he, as someone who did not have a career as a test pilot, I think I'm correct in that, right?
Yeah, he was a test pilot, actually.
He was a test pilot. They all were test pilots. Well, I watched the SpaceX shot last Sunday, and it's still exciting to me. And one thing, though, that there were four astronauts strapped in the capsule, and the anchor asked the what's his name, Tom somebody, who's been covering space shots forever for NBC, asking what he thought they were feeling at this moment. And, you know, a typical anchor question of somebody, but he said, you know, they were excited, but they were calm, and they understood what was going on. But it made me think about, you know, having read your book recently, about how Glenn by himself in the Mercury capsule, how they must feel when they're on top of this interballistic missile that's going to ignite and blast them off, you know, and what might happen.
Right.
It's got to be daunting. And I mean, maybe the test pilots have this sort of ice water in their veins, but Glenn, as you write about him, didn't strike me as the kind of person who wouldn't think about the risk and as you say, commit to taking it for the sake of the mission and what might be learned. I want to ask you a question that I have this question, and it's an important one. My successor, David Brigham, has written in something very similar, and I want to ask you to answer it, please. And he says, did Glenn's identity as a larger-than-life hero make it hard to get at his human qualities in writing the book? And what was the greatest challenge in researching his life?
That is a good question. The greatest, probably the greatest barrier that I faced was that he didn't record much of his life until he got into NASA. And so there was not as much material as you would hope to find. And then you can tell at some point he realized, hey, a lot of people are paying attention to me. Maybe I should be saving all of this. And he had hundreds and hundreds of boxes of Senate documents, which no researcher could go through all of them unless that you had to look at what his interests were and then look at all those boxes and decide which ones are going to take you to the things that really mattered to John Glenn. He kept a couple of diaries at different times during his life, very briefly, but then they sort of broke off. He didn't have a good record of what he'd done with his life. And his wife, although she did a couple of oral histories, she didn't keep things that would tell you more about him. So there was, to a certain degree, because he grew up in a relatively poor family, there wasn't the paper trail that you would find if you were looking to write a book about JFK, for instance, because JFK's family started thinking about keeping records, you know, when the children were born, and it was just a totally different thing. And Glenn's father had a fourth grade education. His mother did get a couple of years at college to get a teaching certificate. But, you know, he was just a regular boy, and they imagined that he would, you know, maybe become a chemist or become a doctor, but they didn't foresee anything really spectacular in his future. So the early years of his life were pretty sketchily drawn, and I was fortunate that he did do oral histories late in life, because that helped to fill some of the gaps about what he remembered about his childhood. But to a large degree, you know, like for instance during the wars, there are records from his supervisors about what kind of job he did or how he tested and that kind of thing. And he did write some things, but you know, all the letters that he wrote to his wife while he was in World War II, which he said he wrote almost every day, those are nowhere to be seen. So that left some gaps in there. So I didn't feel like I had the full story there. Once he got into NASA, he became much more focused on saving things, you know, even if they didn't seem important at the time. He obviously put them in a box and kept them. And also, you know, after he did the Mercury flight, he got tons and tons of mail, fan mail from people all over the world, and he did save a lot of that. And so there's a real sense of how people saw him and how he saw himself, you know, in the way that he addressed their letters and the way that he felt about all the attention.
We've gotten a couple of questions, important questions. I want to be sure we get time to cover both of them. And actually, two people have written to ask about how you think the Keating Five affected him. And maybe there are people who don't understand that. It came about when he was thinking of running for president, was it?
No, it was after that. He ran for president in '84, but the Keating Five situation happened all around 1990, 1989. What happened was that was when the savings and loan industry was facing a huge collapse, because they had begun, many savings and loans had begun investing money more speculatively rather than just, you know, they're investing money in somebody's home. Instead, they were investing money in things that didn't bring the sure returns that savings and loans used to get. And so this was it was a big scandal, and this was while George Herbert Walker Bush was president. And there were certain savings and loans that collapsed and were greatly in debt. And what happened was that one man, Keating, was head of a California savings and loan, and he at one point called 5 US senators in to meet with him, and they sat down and met with him, and they had no idea that he was in any criminal danger until at some point in the middle of the conversation, it became clear that he was afraid that he was going to be charged with some kind of criminal activity. And at that point, Glenn got up and left the room because he didn't want to be involved in any of that. But then later, Glenn thought the criminal threat was gone, and Glenn set up a lunch between Keating and the Speaker of the House. And so at some point, it came out that some of these senators had gotten tremendous campaign contributions from Keating. Glenn had gotten a couple of $100,000, but it was very small compared to what some of the others had gotten. So the Senate did do an investigation, and Glenn was mortified because being morally correct had been a big part of his own identity. And when he found that here he was accused of doing something terrible, he just couldn't believe it. And he was very angry with the committee because the committee had someone do a pre-investigation, and that person suggested that Glenn be taken off the list of people being investigated. And John McCain was also among the 5. And so this person suggested that both Glenn and McCain be taken off the list because they hadn't really done anything wrong. And they were not taken off the list, and so they had to sit through long Senate hearings, and ultimately Glenn was just judged to have used bad judgment when he set up the lunch. That was his big crime, was he set up this lunch. And he did, this caused him not only personal pain, but it also made his reelection in '92 much more difficult than any of his other reelection campaigns, because the Republican who's running against him was able to point to him and say that he had done something wrong and that he had profited from it. And it did really hurt him at that time. And he wrote up for the 1992 campaign, he wrote up a set of rules that he would follow during the campaign. And there were things like, you know, I won't do an attack ad against my opposing candidate. And of course, his opponent didn't do any of this, but, and ultimately, of course, Glenn won. But it certainly hurt him a lot, and it made him in that '92 campaign focus even more on being openly an honorable man and trying to get that message across. He knew, you know, he'd made mistakes along the way, like all people do, and he probably should have kept his distance from Keating. But as the Senate Ethics Committee decided, you know, he really didn't do anything that was that wrong.
That's I think a good segue into the next question. You may laugh about that, but someone has asked about, does your book delve into the spiritual and religious beliefs of Glenn? And I know that it does, but you might talk about that some, please.
Sure. Glenn was raised, you know, in a small town. His parents were both very religious Presbyterians, and they In addition to taking him to church on Sundays and to Sunday school, they had revivals and that kind of thing. And so his youth was very much filled with going to church. And even when he was 40 years old and he was waiting for his Mercury flight in Florida, his routine every week, he waited like 3 months. They kept scheduling it and then canceling it and scheduling it and then canceling it. And he every week he did 2 things. He went to church on Sunday and he got his hair cut. And otherwise he just lived the healthy life. He would run, he would do whatever NASA wanted him to do. But going to church on Sunday was non-negotiable. That was something he was definitely going to do. And it was interesting that after the flight, when he testified before Congress, one congressman asked him, you know, when you're up there and you're in the capsule, are you thinking about God? Are you praying the whole time? What are you doing, you know, in terms of your relationship with God while you're up in space? And he said he was not what he called a fire engine Christian. He didn't believe in just praying when you're in danger. He believed you live your whole life thinking about God, and when you're really in danger, you focus on the work that you have to do and you do the work. You don't sit there playing, you know, praying that God will save you. You do the work and you make sure that you save yourself. And so that's what he did. And he did have a very busy flight because the controls that were supposed to keep the capsule in the right orientation failed. And so he had to keep resetting them, trying to keep the capsule in the right position. And, you know, he said, it's not a situation where you have time to stop and pray. You just keep going, and that's what he did. And his strong religious beliefs stuck with him his whole life. There's a moment in the book where one of the Discovery astronauts finds him, Glenn, sort of floating at one of the windows, staring down at South America during a lightning storm. And Glenn's just very silent, staring out the window. And the astronaut asks him, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm in church." And that's the kind of life he had.
I was thinking of that as I was listening to you to talk, and I'm glad you relayed that story. That was, I like that part of it. We have time for a couple more questions, and one is from Chris Van Buskirk, who says, John Glenn has been portrayed many times in TV and movies, most recently in Nat Geo's interpretation of The Right Stuff, a few years ago in Hidden Figures, and in the 1980s in the original movie of The Right Stuff. His moral certitude is always central to depictions of him and is portrayed in varying lights. If you're familiar with these depictions, which I know you are, which do you think is closest to the real man?
I think that probably Tom Wolfe's original book, The Right Stuff, that the film was based on and that the current series is based on, portrayed him as being a straight-laced guy, but it was not what you might call, you know, obsessive. And Glenn liked Wolfe's book, but he hated the movie. He thought that the movie made him seem like a goody-goody, you know, and that was, he didn't want to be called a goody-goody, but one of his best friends told me that's exactly what he was. He was a goody-goody. I don't know that any film can really capture, you know, a real human being's essence. I have watched the current series, and I think they've made a little effort to make Glenn less of a cardboard figure than he perhaps was in the original movie. I think in Hidden Figures, what he was shown doing did really happen. He really did go and ask for one of the African American mathematician women to double check his course to make sure the computer had figured it out right. And that really did happen, and that really does sound like something he would do. And so I just can't say which one is the true Glenn, because I think the true Glenn was somebody separate from all of those portrayals.
Well, nobody got it exactly right.
I don't think so.
There's one other question that I think you can answer in 30 seconds, which is about as much time as we've got. And I mean, the short answer is yes, but someone wants to know if your book addresses his testimony during the congressional hearings on astronaut selection about women in the space program. And as I say, I think the answer is yes, but maybe you can say how he corrected his testimony.
I think when he was asked in 1962, he thought too much inside the box. He said, an astronaut has to be a test pilot, and women can't be test pilots, so women can't be astronauts. And that was his simple answer. And that didn't think beyond that to, well, maybe astronauts don't have to be test pilots, and maybe women could be test pilots. And so I do address that. Later in life, he said he was very fine with having women on space flights, and he was very fine with having different kind of scientists on space flights, not just a bunch of test pilots. And it was just, but it was an issue that plagued him the whole rest of his life. And even on the day that he died, I found an online post that day from somebody who was still really angry with him about his position on women in space.
So it's not surprising, and the question is not surprising either, and very welcome. Well, Alice, we've come to the 8 o'clock hour, and I think we should say goodnight and thank everyone for signing in. I want to point out that the book is, if you haven't seen it yet, the book is available at Barnes & Noble and on Amazon, and there are autographed copies at Shakespeare and Company, both in Philadelphia and their New York offices. This program was recorded. If you know people who missed it and want to see it, it will be available on the Historical Society's website. I can't promise it'll be available tomorrow, but it will be very soon. We thank you all for tuning in, and we hope you will check the website for the next program. And I want to call attention to the fact that, and most of you know, that David Brigham will become the next president and CEO of the Historical Society a week from Monday. We all welcome him very much. And if you don't know about David, you can read about him, and the reason he was so quickly chosen to be the next president is evident in reading about his biography on the website of Historical Society. So thank you all very much. We had a wonderful discussion. Thank you, Alice. It's a really good book. You write so well. You and I have edited each other for 4 years, and maybe we'll continue doing that, but you're the better editor for sure, and certainly the better writer. So thank you all very much. Good night.
Good night. Thanks, Charles.
Thank you.